Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Today, we're going to break from our usual template, and instead of looking at philosophical abstractions and attempting to extrapolate meaning from them, we're going to examine the life of a philosopher, his ideas, and how they affect the world. I look forward to sprinkling in many of these episodes over time, and our first subject is a titan in the field. Considered by many the creator of the thesis, and someone who understood philosophy comprehensively, today we examine Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. All right, so you and I have talked about doing some of these episodes in the past, kind of looking at specific philosophers. And I think it'll be good because I think doing these separate series, rather than doing a consecutive series based on a school of philosophy or a philosopher or a certain pantheon of gods, I think it will be kind of fun to just sort of sprinkle them in throughout time, kind of give the podcast a little bit of variety. So this will be our first time looking at a philosopher, and we're not starting with Plato or Aristotle or Confucius or so. Some people might not be real familiar with Hegel. I know that I'm definitely not as familiar with his stuff as with the aforementioned philosophers. So
yes.
But as I did some research for the show, I started to think, man, this guy he's one of the most interesting characters in the.
Yeah, he's one of the giants.
For sure. So we'll kind of go through and look at him, and then it'll follow a similar format. We'll look at the formative aspects of the philosopher, and then kind of the essence of his philosophy, and then we'll sort of try to apply some of his ideas to the world that we currently live in. Yeah. So, starting with the formative, is there any biographical or contextual factors about Hegel we should know about before we get into it?
Well, yeah, he was. I don't want to sound stereotypical, but he's a relatively humble background. You and I often talk about religion and such, and he was born into a Protestant family. He went to a seminary. It's one of those times one of those moments where things happen where occasionally you get a cluster of people all in the same place at the same time. So when he went to cemetery, he met the poet Hölderlin, and he met Schelling, who was also a philosopher. And so you start having all kinds of discussions, and he ended up doing his doctorate in philosophy. And then he ended up in a university town, which was the place where Napoleon marched in. And there's an artist who actually did an imaginary painting of on the side of the street when Napoleon's riding his horse down the street. There's Hegel welcoming Napoleon. So he was somebody who, I think like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and the cluster of people, or think of in World War II, all of these, Roosevelt and Churchill and so on, all ending up in the same place at the same time. These things seem to happen sometimes, and so he has people to bounce off of in a sense. And because of his view on history, which we'll get to, some had difficulty with him because in that he seemed to be in support of, if not dictators, then strong figures. But what his views were more complicated than that would sound. Also, his books, if one tries to read them, I mean, this is serious academic reading, and so it's not something people are going to pick up and just find their way through at first go. It's not that his language in translation in English is difficult. It's that it's seemingly so abstract that it takes a good think. Because he is talking about large forces rather than microcosmic things.
Yeah, and a lot of his writing is the definition of complex, because he's, as we'll get into a little bit later, his a big part of his thought is combining, is sublating concepts, taking things that are apparently contradictory or opposed to one another, and attempting to meld them into a new understanding of what he's talking about. And even saying it that way, you can imagine, oh wow, that sounds like that would be sort of hard to understand.
Yeah. I mean, it's going. We will, the people who are listening to us, despite our efforts to make this, not make this a university classroom, it's going to be complicated. Mm-hmm. So we'll go to pop culture as we usually do and try to find our models.
Right. Okay, so what are some of the primary things Hegel is known for?
His theory of history, his theory of art, which is related. He is known for trying to pull the historical and artistic aesthetic discussion away from positivism or materialism, which the only thing that is real is that which we can see and touch and so on, more into an idealist camp.
So thinking about him in the context of his lifetime, what people have to realize is sort of the philosophical milieu of the time, which was that, you had a lot of philosophy was focused around, like you said, materialism, things that are concrete, but also on kind of delineating concepts. So, separating, polarizing things. And Hegel was very influenced by a lot of mystical sort of writings. And like you mentioned, he was a religious figure.
He was brought up in
Right. So he was more thinking, less about, not less about, but not of things in terms of just being materialistic, like you were saying, but what is beyond the physical, and how do some of these things that appear to be contradictory, that the philosophy of his time were saying were contradictory and identifying as distinct concepts, how did they maybe come from this singular source,
Yeah, exactly. To put it a nutshell. All right. He was of the belief, as a number of whole philosophical school is, in idealism, essentially. We don't have direct access to anything. We don't perceive the world directly. All our minds have access to is the ideas that we ourselves or others form about the world. Which has led to cartoons and so on about somebody holding up a stone and dropping it on Hegel or any other number of philosophers' feet, and say, well, that's real, isn't it? But you and I, before the show started, we're talking about virtual reality.
Right.
And this is why I think Hegel would really, and sometimes this is the Americanization, this is the Britishism. He's Hegel, he's Hegel. Hegel is how I was always. So that's, if I slip into that, you'll forgive me. But the idea that really all we have is virtual reality.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, you and I were talking before the show. I got an Oculus for Christmas, virtual reality, and I've done virtual reality before, but on a cheaper platform, and it basically amounts to kind of a semi 3D environment where you're doing something. The Oculus is a completely different thing. It's totally immersive. And as I was explaining to you, basically my mind, knows that it's a virtual reality, but the Oculus does such a good job of tricking my other senses, visually, the auditory aspect of it, even the tactile experience, it's sending buzzes to the controllers and things when you're touching things, doing stuff that, it tricks the physical part of me into believing that I'm in a different world. And so that has huge philosophical implications for, looking at, like we were talking about a few weeks ago with the mind-body problem.
Exactly.
If you're a monist, and you're thinking, okay, well, everything is just one. Well, then it would be hard virtual reality sort of throws a wrench in that a little bit, where it's like, okay, well, I logically know that this isn't the real world, yet my body is reacting and parts of my brain are reacting as if it is, uncontrollably, outside of my control. I can't really, things in the real world are surprising me while I'm in this virtual world, or, I'm reacting in such a way I'm actually ducking or actually doing things that I'm reacting to things that, quote, are not there,
Which very, as you say, it connects to what we were talking about a few weeks ago. Can you respond to something that isn't there? Absolutely. Can your physical process, your metabolism, alter because of something that you see that is intangible? You
remember we talked about this a while back when we did our show on nostalgia. Nostalgia. Yep. People who experience nostalgia in cold weather environments, actually their physical body temperature raises, Yeah. So the wonders of the human mind are so we were talking about things that Hegel's known for. And one of those was the Geist, right?
Yes, the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times. There's another word, zeitgeist, that gets so overused now, but essentially it's a development out of that. And of course, Hegel was German, and so so Geist is. So we're talking. This is the other thing. We're talking about the ideas of a person rendered in German and translated for us. And whenever we go to a translation, we are already second, third, fourth handing ourselves in the hands of very competent and dutifully careful translators. That could take us back to religious sacred texts, but we won't need to go there right now. But the idea is that you're one step and then another step away from that original. Some things in a language can't be wholly translated into another. Mm-hmm. Right? We stumble on that. So when we say that the spirit of the times, he's talking about history as a process. Okay, we can get that. But for him, individual mentality is not important in that process. In the sense that there's a dynamic that drives historical events and the countering of those historical events that is contributed to by the collective but not any one individual. And I don't claim to be a master of Hegel either. But these are some of the more common things that one picks up in reading him in translation and in reading analysis of him and in hearing people's lectures of him and so on.
All right, and the Geist is kind of his big idea, right? That's sort of he had his fingers in all aspects of philosophy, pretty much everything that you could. Yeah. But his thoughts on history and the Geist was sort of his main idea. So, and that's what we're going to focus on towards the latter part of the episode. Is there any other things that we should touch on about him before we get into that too far?
Probably, because these are all things that I'm trying to find some connection to other things we've talked about. So Hegel was somebody we would call a compatibilist from an ethics viewpoint, or from he didn't entirely believe in free will. He didn't entirely believe in determinism. There was this fusion of the two things. He didn't think that God was this completely outside factor being, what have you. But he also didn't think it was just what people say about God. It was more complicated. There was an infusion, an organicism. And this, of course, helped complicate in his time. Because remember, he was born 6 years before the American Revolution began. And he lived into about 1830, 31. And so he was seeing a lot of historical events on a big scale, both in the British colonies becoming the United States, and then in France, and in Germanic areas. So this, I think, is he was trying to express the complexity of there's not just one thing that causes everything to happen.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes him sort of difficult to talk about in some regard, is because, a lot of the philosophical ideas that we've talked about so far, the way that we go about understanding them is by, starting out with the main concept and breaking it down into sub-concepts and then exploring what makes them up. And Hegel's whole philosophy kind of flies in the face of doing that. It's more about, he, like you said, was he a determinist or an indeterminist? Well, not really. Well, was he an atheist or a religious person? Well, it's kind of a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Some might call him agnostic. People have wondered about that kind of thing, written loads about that with him. He was fusing together things that heretofore had not been fused, and so the idea of Geist is not just spirit, but of mind, of rationality, of even, one might say, logic. I'm going to jump to a pop cultural reference. In some sense, one could say that if one ever was a Star Trek experiencer of any kind, not necessarily a fan, that Vulcans would be a group that Hegel would say had pretty much arrived at the end of history. Because for him, history was, the idea was that these dynamic processes counter, something happens, there's a counter to it, something rebalances. Picture a ladder swinging back and forth in the wind when you're trying to finally achieve a balance. And the balance will, he thought, eventually be achieved when total acceptance of logic and rationality, the truth balance of the mind itself, had been achieved.
Yeah, and it really, he had some interesting ways of putting that. I can't remember if we talked about it on the podcast or if it was a conversation you and I had outside of it the last time we did the show, but I was talking to you about an article where scientists were saying that the universe was simulating itself, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So,
we talked about that.
Okay. Yeah, that was on the show. So, there's been theories floating around for a while now that our whole reality is actually a simulation that's been put in progress by an advanced alien species.
Yes.
Well, recently they've done some, physics experiments, and they're saying, well, you know what? It might actually make more sense that the universe is just sort of simulating itself into existence. Well, that's basically Hegel's philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's good that you've gone there, because when he talks about the historical process, he essentially, I think, was making the point, huge point, that we have to understand history through the primary documents, the thinking as presented by people of what they were thinking and why they were making the decisions they were making and so on. But that the difficulty with that is that you can't get caught up in the cult of personality and say, oh, well, I'm going to just sway to the thinking of this very powerful idea as espoused by a number of people. I have to try to understand how those ideas collectively led to a place where then a counter idea arose, and then somehow those are pulled together. So the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But this is where what you mentioned a moment ago, to me, lends itself very interestingly, because if the possibility is that we are, let's say, we are a simulation. Well, that would take an enormous set of technical and logical and rational powers to create such a thing. But what a way to try to figure out the historical process itself. What were people thinking? Why did the collective of people do this or do that? Well, create a whole simulation in which you follow that through to see what happened.
Right, and that's where we're at, 22 minutes into the show, we're finally starting to develop the idea of what Hegel was about, which is, like we talked about, a very hard thing to conceptualize, but it kind of boils down to the thing within itself, right? His whole idea was he used life as a big metaphor for everything else in the universe. And one of those examples was, if you have a child, right? Let's say we talked about Napoleon earlier. Let's say we have Napoleon as a child, right? You can see Napoleon and you can examine what sort of factors have gone into the child Napoleon to that point, who his parents were, what his education was, who his friends were, the country he lived in, his culture, and that sort of thing. And then you can try to extrapolate what Napoleon will be in the future, but it's never going to quite be accurate, because he's going to run into new friends or new cultures or have different experiences that are going to kind of alter it. Yeah. So he's just sort of this constant work in progress. And Hegel's view was that process is history, right? That work in progress kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And for him, as I best understand it, his the manifestation of that Geist, that spirit, in any culturally located collective is going to be the document of the government itself, the Constitution. Because he was of the time when constitutions were beginning to be created. So he's located in his own time because of that. But what he was showing us or exploring was asserting that the Constitution of any given is the spirit of that particular nation. And so the written Constitution is the material formulated, articulated, and therefore not complete spirit of that particular group at that particular time.
Yeah, so Hegel talked about circles within circles. You had this, I talked about Napoleon as an individual and that sort of process. And what you're talking about is that same process, but in terms of a nation state. Again, like we were talking about, you can look at the historical context of the nation and then where the nation's at, and you can extrapolate out. But the nation is kind of constantly making itself. In Hegel's view, you could take that all the way up to sort of the metaphysical playing, like we were talking about earlier. You have the universe simulating itself. Well, in another interesting article this week I read, they were scientists were trying to determine if the universe is a fractal, right?
Yeah.
And so the universe is a fractal is that same circle within a circle idea, right? If the universe at a large scale looks like this, and the universe at a small scale looks at the same thing, that again is what Hegel's talking about. You know, if people are going through this process, and nation states are going through this process, and the whole universe is going through this process, then that sort of idea that he had of life and, you know, these contextual factors and things growing towards, you know, an actual state of completion or, you know, whatnot. It's kind of it's a really thought-provoking.
It is thought-provoking, and it's large scale. I mean, he essentially was trying to capture and explain the structure of philosophy, human rationality, and government across time. That's a great big project, and that's what makes some of the things inaccessible. But he did. You know, some people said, well, that they were, I think, misconstruing him to some extent as liking strongmen. No, he's the constitution of any individual nation is the spirit manifested, and it's a thesis. It's an arguable idea, and he thought that one of the greatest crimes, greatest as in horrific crimes, is any act that is taken by a tyrant or would-be tyrant or a conqueror, which will stifle or render inert that constitution. And he saw that happen. He saw the swing, so to speak, of not only what was happening in, which he could look back on, because as I said, he was 6 years old, so he wasn't necessarily pondering, although he educated himself at a very young age, but he was seeing these swings from the monarchic constitutionalism or monarchy republic to an attempt at a so-called liberal constitution, which then leads to the terrors in France and years of bloodshed and horror and paranoia and so on, which then leads to something more of a balance, which itself he wouldn't argue was perfect. But the very fact that he's talking about a constitutional monarchy, he wasn't in support of tyrants. He was trying to put these two ideas together, not unlike when we've talked about this before, a democratic republic. Two antithetical things, really, in a number of ways, and stuck together.
Right? Yeah. Are you going to give individual people a say in the government, or are they going to have representatives that that choose for them? Well, you can synthesize the two, and that's what Hegel is about. So, like you were saying, you could construe it as him. Like you said, liking dictators or something, but really he's probably, what he's saying is that you can't have one without the other, right? A monarchy and a democracy, you have a democracy because you had a monarchy, right? It's a reaction or a growth process, and you kind of swing back and forth between the two.
Yeah.
Did I have that right?
Yeah, I think you do, and this is where I always find myself being humbled by ridiculous things that I've said in the past. I remember being outraged by Star Wars, where in one of these sets of films, I believe it was the first of the middle, you had an elected queen. Right, and I said that's ridiculous, but I wasn't thinking about my Hegel in the sense that there is this attempt at, there was in Lucas and in pop cultural fashion, but nonetheless this clashing notion that somehow existed up there on the screen. He says that he believed that reason is what governs the world, and what governs history. But reason, in all the process so far, has never been perfect or adhered to without great flaws. And so reasoning in argumentation, as we know, this takes us back to that, is I assert an arguable statement and I offer support for it. Perhaps that becomes realized in some kind of constitutional system. The conversations that deeply, emotively felt horrors that people in our own country have experienced, especially race, emerges out of a problematic, if not dysfunction, then incompleteness and lack of vision, because of locked in its time, of a constitution that, if it were completely static, would not allow for itself to be changed in our own cultural circumstance. But then we have amendments, don't we? But then we have forces where we can look at it now, and if, I think Hegel would be saying to us right now that if we are at a moment where if we can come to terms with the flaws of our own constitution and the limits to the reason, limits primarily perhaps that occurred because of self-interest of the founders in their own contexts. And if we come to terms with that and re-see ourselves with fresher and honest eyes, honest meaning the eyes of reason, what was really happening here, then we would be in the process of a synthesis.
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I'm not entirely clear on it. So I'm going to ask you some questions.
Okay.
What about essentially Hegel and relativism? What were Hegel's views in a morality context?
You mean about the beliefs of individuals, or the result of the larger system?
Yeah, let's start with the result of the larger system. So, I mean, he talked about the prevailing of logic and reason and this sort of thing. Did he believe that there was a good or bad sort of force, or was it just sort of this balance of logic?
He believed that there were bad actors. He wouldn't have used that phrase that way, but tyrants and so on. He believed that people could look out after their self-interest in place of thinking about the larger good of the society. And so in some ways, I think there's a Kantian element there. But ultimately, I think Hegel was defaulting to the rightness of the entire system as opposed to the rightness of individuals within it. And that's how, again, why his ethics, or what was right, would be a larger picture rather than individuals having complete freedom and therefore being able to disrupt everything.
Okay. Same question for the logic, right? So logic, as he's not looking for logic on the individual level, but he's looking for the logic of the state as a whole.
Yeah. Reason as the spirit of all the individuals melded together. You see, this is that Marx took Hegel's work and was shaping Marx and Engels was shaping their theory based on that large scale picture. If the rational by itself the rational alone is the reality, then you can categorize things rationally, and so then you presumably you can deal with ethical violations with a complete reason. Now that sounds really good, but how take a moment from our own historically located time right now. What happened in Washington? The insurrection. How are they constructing? Who actually went inside? Who were actually the bad actors? Who were actually the people who were outside and not knowing necessarily what was going on the inside? Who were the people who were killing in their madness that police officer, breaking windows, stealing things, putting their feet on desks? Well, now we've got unlike in Hegel's time, we've got visual record. In a sense, the rioters, the insurrectionists, created their own historical record via cell phone and internet and Facebook and blah, blah, blah. So now that can be used and must. And this is, I think, what Hegel would say is it must be looked at and used in order to advance the justice of the society, to address the antithesis that has been created, to come to some new position. So it's large scale ethics.
Right, and that it really is just a interesting microcosm, and probably something we have never seen before in the history of the world. Because if you're reading in your history book about, during the time Hegel would live, the United States Revolution or the French Revolution or whatever the case may be, you're distilling down to a couple paragraphs, years of history, and not only years of history, but very circumstantial, subjective history, right? You had people who were documenting that during the time, but it was through their own lens, and what things were getting recorded and not recorded was very spotty. But we tend to accept the written history as being sort of the final record. What it could just happen, what currently happened, is different because the tools are in place to objectively look at this historical event, right?
Yes.
There's nobody writing down with their own coloring or shading of the events. There's video evidence of what happened. There's pictorial evidence of what happened. You can identify individual people and what they did, and then sort of extrapolate what sort of intentions were behind a movement with much more precision and detail than you ever could in the past.
Well, yeah, but to some extent, but also what Hegel is saying is just like he would say that these are primary documents, this video evidence. Pictorial evidence. I think it would say that you have to read the letters of the people who are making the decisions to try to figure out what they were thinking, not to be swayed into their viewpoint, but to try to understand how that contributed to an event, a process that then had to have its own counter. How did that countering happen? What was leading to that? So no summative of the history book is going to do that. The primary documents are going to do that. But I would respond to that other point that you mentioned. It's not what they're saying. Essentially, the people don't color it with their words. Oh, they're coloring it with their words a lot. When they're describing what they're doing and calling themselves patriots, and they're trying to recast the event, or they're expressing that virtual world in which they live, that they think that this is somehow a patriotic act, and so the words are important to understand the geist of that particular cluster of people and now more than ever we are in a Hegelian kind of situation, I think, because of this constant bipolarity of our own situation. When you've got 48% and 52%, you've got a clear majority of people who elected a president the country clashes with itself on, well, did this actually happen? Yes, it happened. The documentation shows it happened. The checks and cross-checks and cross-balances happened. The irrationality of the attempt to cast it a different way is counter to reason. And so Hegel, I think, would say we have to try to understand the difference between how people present themselves and not take them at their word, but to look at what that event, any given event, how it has led to response change and a closer trip toward rationality and reason.
Yeah, and like you were saying, our current context in America is it's never been more important than this. And like we were painting the picture with Napoleon as a child earlier in the show, about his background and his future and stuff. If you do the same thing, like we talked about, extrapolating it out for a nation state, like Hegel would say we can, and talking about the importance of the state documents and constitutions and things, you can look back at those historical documents and you can trace the logic behind certain movements. And that's why the relativistic view of the logic, which I'm not sure Hegel had, like we talked about.
Right. I wouldn't call him relativist.
Right. And I might break with him there a little bit, because I think that there is some... hear me out here. So logic, you're basing it off of contextual factors, background knowledge, all of these different things, cultural factors, all this, and then extrapolating it out. So if we look at the United States, right, we've talked about our Constitution, and there's blatantly racial things in elements of our Constitution. And so with that, and with contextual factors about the history of the country, and then where you grow up in the country, what sort of experiences you've had, the characters that have influenced your thinking. You might have 56,000 tweets of first, original documentation of somebody they're following. I don't think that one side or the other is acting necessarily illogically. I think that there's a logic behind both polarizing movements. Yeah. What we need to do, and I think what you were saying, what Hegel is saying is that what he always said throughout his whole philosophy is that, okay, you have a thesis and you have an antithesis, and neither one of those things exists of its own. The one requires the other, and when these things clash, there's an inevitable synthesis that happens. We haven't reached that point yet. We have the thesis and the antithesis. Both of these sides have a logic for why they believe what they believe. And I think on the conservative end of the spectrum, on the right end of the spectrum, what you're looking at is the cultural precedents that have been set. If you look at other developed countries, they rewrite their constitutions on a regular basis. It's pretty normal to revise constitutions. In the U.S., there's this almost cultish devotion to the founding fathers' words, which if you have to look at it, you have to say, okay, well, they lived in a context. They lived with certain facts, certain influences, certain things that are no longer relevant.
Yeah.
That's not to say that they didn't arrive at certain inalienable truths about humanity. But the point is, you have to take what things they stumbled upon that were good and applicable to human society, to government workings, and you have to discard the things that they were wrong about or were biased about and come up with a new system. And in America, I think on the conservative end of the spectrum, they're completely unwilling to do that. There's this devotion to the original state of things, and then on the other hand, you have a progressive side of things. And so, I think what needs to happen, coming out of the recent events that we've had, is I think that on the winning end, right? So there's a blue wave happening, right? People, I think, as Hegel would say, logic and rationality is winning out by a razor thin margin in the U.S. But people are seeing what's happening, and at some level, they're saying, "Nah, you know what? I'm just not going along with this." But what needs to happen is, rather than these two sides isolating themselves now and trying to win over people to their side, I think what needs to happen is a critical examination of the other side and saying, okay, what are they saying that makes sense, that has merit, and that can be integrated into my viewpoints of the world in order to progress society, humanity, into something that is more,
Bingo. Yeah, I'm going to insert this because you've articulated this very sharply. He talked about the subjectivity of the will, right? And so essentially what is moral is not characterized by being opposed to the immoral. It's opposition to wrong, or whatever the way we want to phrase it. Morality and immorality are founded on the idea of the subjectivity of the will. Another way of putting this is, what seems to be the will of a given people, and how is it misconstrued or misapplied or used to wrong purpose? That's part of it. Perhaps a simpler way, not simpler, but a clearer way would be to use a theatrical term. In theater, one always, among many, many other things, asks, what is the intention of the character? Well, in broader scope, he would say, what is the intention of this collective asserting this particular thing? And one must try to understand that intention and then counter that intention, if it needs countering, with reason, with argumentation, which realizes itself eventually through physical acts. So yeah, we are at a moment when certainly there's call and response. There is back and forth. There is blame and counter blame. But there are things that are reasonably blameworthy from a rational viewpoint, from actions taken. But the harder part is to try to understand how that went. Any particular thing went south, so to speak.
And I think that something that a part of it that may make more sense. We've talked about how Hegel could be misconstrued as liking dictators or strongmen, but I think that it's a little bit. It's different. It's not liking so much as if you're looking at the big picture and saying, okay, well, human trajectory that is towards an ultimate rationality, or or an ultimate logic, well, then really, as painful as a Donald Trump may be, in some ways it might be the best thing that can happen in terms of forging a synthesis, because this sort of extreme figure casts in relief and contrast other aspects of it. And I think that, honestly, I think that you might be seeing it happen a little bit in the Republican Party, because you're seeing certain individuals after this incident at the Capitol building. There's some people who were firmly in Trump's camp that after the events at the Capitol are saying, I don't support this. This isn't what I experienced. And there's some of us that would say, well, how could you not see this sort of thing as being something that could happen all along?
Yes.
But the fact is, they didn't. And now that it has happened, their view and their perspective on the entire movement could possibly be being changed in regards to what happened. So
right.
I think that
they didn't, or they did see it, but it wasn't to their benefit at that moment. I mean, there's always that kind of thing too. But ultimately, the same is. It can result in what you're describing. It can result in, let's really think hard about what has happened here. And there are people who are just going on and saying the same thing. They're just spouting the same things today that they were spouting before it happened, which indicates no thought whatsoever going on. And then there are those who are saying there have to be consequences, not out of a sense of vengeance, but out of a sense of rationality. What do we? If one teaches one's children that there are consequences for actions taken, and you have right at the top of the chain actions called for and hope to not have consequences for those actions, that can undermine the very moral, ethical fabric of any particular constitution. That's the crisis point here. If one says, oh, well, that just happened 2 days ago and on we go, then we are in the deadliest point ever.
Right.
And any culture would be.
Yeah, and I think that we also have to identify where to draw the line. Again, looking at extrapolating individual experiences into an experience of the state, right?
Yeah.
If you have a child, and you sort of have to delineate the difference between wrongdoing and a mistake, right?
Yeah.
Wrongdoing requires punishment, requires consequences.
Yeah.
Making a mistake merely requires a reflection and a new course of action. And so I think that that's what we need a little bit on both sides too, is for people to identify, listen, it's very hard with religion or politics or personal issues to ever admit that you're wrong or that you made a mistake.
Yeah.
But there's certain points where you can no longer deny it, right? And I think that it happens to us all. Maybe I take a test in school and I flunk it, right? That tells me, okay, I thought I knew this, but I didn't. I need to reevaluate my thinking and my course of action. Maybe some of these people who were very strongly on one side or the other experience a political event that makes them say, you know what, I thought I understood what my political beliefs are, but now that I see the fruition of them, this is not what I want to believe. I think that the key is with those people, we can't treat them the same as we're treating people who are actually perpetuating the crimes against society. There needs to be,
which is why you have to parse it, right? Or not parse it. You find the people who killed someone. You find the people who broke and stole. And you follow the rational prosecutorial laws of the country, but you apply those equally. I think that the illogic made manifest that in event is as clear as those photographs we've been seeing in contrast, with police on multi-tiers of the Capitol building on steps, back when our president was trying to clear the streets to walk across to show a Bible, with a line of Capitol Police officers essentially with no defensive capacities whatsoever, and hours of not having anyone move in to do anything about it, and a military that conversation is quoted as the police, Capitol Police calling for help, and the military said, "You need help? Yes. We need to think." But the military responding, "But we need to think about the optics of this." So rather than reasonable action, then the intention becomes what it looks like, rather than what is. And I think that's where Hegel, I would rather arrogantly assert that that's probably the kind of level of conversation he would be applying to this incident, to any incident. What is the overall large picture? What is the result of individual intentions that build up into a large snowball coming down to create an avalanche? What is the intention of the avalanche? And how is that to be addressed in a counter argument?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's one of those things where, I mean, we're just looking at, okay, like you said, there's intentions. There's also a lot of background information that goes into how parties make logical decisions, and most importantly, and we're at a crux point in history for this, is how are these two sides eventually going to synthesize what is meritorious about their various arguments, and how are they going to shed beliefs that are counterproductive to the propagation of the society, Yeah. And we don't have those answers yet, because people at this point are refusing to have the conversations. So hopefully we're on the cusp of a new era in American history where we start to get to those points. But
I hope so. I mean, one of the things that he said, Joel, I want to toss this in because it's sort of, I think it pulls it together. In translation, the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. And then a whole lot of verbiage after that about, but the progress is not steady, step by step, gentle. No, it's a lurch. It's a wrenching lurch.
And what sort of logic you're using to determine freedom, especially in the United States? Are you looking at freedom in terms of capabilities for all people, or are you looking at freedom in terms of things that a majority group has had access to that they are losing access to in order to, fulfill a greater mandate?
And when a collective of people do not understand the very definitions of freedom that are embedded in a constitution, and I think it would be fair to say that all of us have misconceived notions about what freedom we actually have until we actually read the document and think about it and discuss it. There's a discussion going on this very morning about the fact that one of the folks, Stephen Hawley, or Holly, last name Holly, the youngish guy who's been trying to assert himself for a candidacy for Republican presidency in 2024, and has been trying to block, delegitimize the votes and so on. Well, he has a book coming out. The publishers rescinded the contract for his book. And he's jawboning right now about all this. See, this is the cancel culture. But you see, no, publishers get to publish what they want. It's a capitalistic, it always has been. Now, we're in a world where he can go on and self-publish his own book, but he clearly wants the stamp of that particular publisher on it, and that particular publisher has determined that because of the actions taken of the words said, they no longer can align themselves with or underwrite the words. That isn't cancel culture. That is a decision taken by editors and a board saying, nope, this is not good for our publishing house. But we don't understand. If we just say, well, that's cancel. Oh, his freedom of speech has been sat upon. No, it hasn't. It hasn't in the least. He has many other ways of doing that.
Right. And again, we're talking about the patterns that scale up, right? The Constitution wanted to guarantee these freedoms of speech and so forth, freedoms of press and whatnot, to individuals. But we've talked about in the past as well how businesses are considered individuals as well. So you have a collective of people whose stakeholders are allowed to determine what sort of things they want their company to stand for, what sort of things. And so it continues to scale up. Yeah. But what the United States guarantees is that individuals like you and I right now, we have a podcast. We have a platform to reach people. Are we going to reach as many people as if we were endorsed by NPR and put on the radio? No, absolutely not. But the fact is, nobody can come in here and tell us to shut down production on our podcast because we're saying something that they don't like, you know?
Precisely.
So yeah, I mean, so it's been a great conversation. We covered a lot of stuff. It's going to open a lot of avenues for future discussions that I'm looking forward to. But until next time, keep pondering.